with his brothers. You notice multiple times he uses that phrase, the son of Jesse. If you read it in the original language and in the context of how it is used to speak of David derisively. He's insulting David. Saul is pointing out his lowly birth and the fact that he's basically just a peasant. And he's ignoring any relationship that would bind him to the royal family. And you say, well, now what relationship would that be? Remember, David's his own son-in-law. Remember that whole business about whoever the man is that kills this giant, he's going to get my daughter and he's going to get the first tax break that I know of that you read officially in Scripture. He's not going to have to pay any income tax for the rest of his life. But Jonathan is covering for David, and he's trying to give Saul a plausible and truthful explanation of David's absence. It would seem that David probably went first to Bethlehem while Jonathan was breaking the news to Daddy, and that he wasn't going to be at dinner and then returned to the field. Well, Saul gets really, really angry. He gets fiercely angry. And Jonathan now knows beyond the shadow of any doubt from the response of his father that David was exactly right. Saul is set on doing harm to him. More than just doing harm, Saul wants to kill him. And then that whole dialogue, you might notice it there, that whole dialogue after insulting David and his lineage, that whole conversation about Jonathan's lineage, the dialogue about Jonathan's mother. Now, I'll just tell you both then and now, things are getting pretty bad when you start trashing a fellow's mother, you know? And in the original language, and I looked at this very carefully, in the original language, I will tell you that there is no other way to sugarcoat it. So I'm just going to tell you the truth. Saul called Jonathan's mother a prostitute with an ugly word. And he called Jonathan a child of unmarried parents with another ugly word. He basically said, you don't have any royal blood in your veins anyway, so you don't deserve the crown. You don't deserve to be in charge of the kingdom. It gets pretty hardcore now, don't you think? And so Saul taunts Jonathan that as long as this guy that you've befriended and believe in and you love more than you love your own family, as long as he's alive, let me tell you something, son, you can forget about ever being king. It's not going to happen. And you can forget about ever sitting on the throne of Israel. You can forget about ever wearing a crown. You can forget about ruling over a kingdom. Saul still does not acknowledge that God is the one who's in control of all of this, and that Jonathan could not have had the kingdom even if he had wanted it, even if he had cooperated with Saul completely, whatever his schemes or plans might have been, because God has already decided upon a successor. God has already set into motion who will be the next king of Israel. Jonathan got it. He got it. Sadly, Saul never did. He never did. So Jonathan defends his friend, and he states one more time, David does not deserve to die. He's not done anything deserving of death. He's done nothing wrong. And Daddy now hurls a spear at him. And this is just an aside note here. It's just something I noticed. There's no extra charge for this. Have you ever noticed that Saul wasn't a very good shot? He just wasn't a very good shot. Dr. Lloyd, you may be able to help me here. I don't know how many times he threw a spear at somebody, but I don't ever read of a single time that he hit the target. He wouldn't have been a very good deer hunter, would he? He's just not a very good shot. And then the text tells us the obvious. Jonathan knew that his father would not stop until David was dead. And he was furious at Saul. And he got up and left the feast. Now, the text indicates that he got up because of his anger and because of the answer that he just got. And he got up out of his chair and he left the feast. And I believe that's completely true. I would have gotten up out of my chair and left the feast if somebody threw a spear at me and missed before he had a chance to reload and shoot at me again. Well, let's go back to the text now. Let's read 35 to 40. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him. And he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows that I shoot." Remember, that was the plan. And the boy ran. As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Now let's just pause here for a moment in the middle of the reading. Remember, if he was going to send him to one side, you're almost there, it's going to be to your right a little bit or the left of the stone or whatever the case may be. What was that going to mean? That meant that David was going to be safe. If he said, no, you hadn't gone far enough, you got to go further, it's beyond you. That was the news David didn't want to hear. Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. The boy knew nothing of all this. Only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go, carry them back to town." That's the pre-arranged signal of the arrows. Jonathan and David determined that if the arrows were shot at a shorter distance, David could know and be assured that Saul's heart was favorable toward him. If the arrows were shot further beyond, then David would know that Saul's heart was still hard and he was determined to kill him. I think it took great courage for Jonathan to communicate with David as he did, even to do it secretly, because he knew that if his father ever got wind of that he himself would face that murderous rage that his father's previously expressed toward him. Basically, Saul was already trying to practice what I just discussed a moment ago about what happens when a new family comes in and the old family goes out. Saul's just going to eliminate anyone who challenges his reign. And there was just something so noble in Jonathan's commitment to David as his friend. I think this is an important piece of information in the life of David, and I'll touch on it again in just a moment. But it's important for David to understand this kind of loyalty and this kind of commitment. I think about another time in David's life when he was on the run and he was in harm's way, death's way. And you remember he was just musing to himself, and he just said, "If I could just have a drink of water from the well that we used to draw the water from, it would just lift my spirits. It would be so refreshing." And you remember that those mighty men, they fought their way across the garrison of soldiers, and they put the skin down in the well, and they drew it back out, and they brought it back to David. It was an expression of their loyalty and their love and their devotion to him. You remember what David said? David said, I can't drink this. No man deserves this. No flesh and blood, no human deserves this kind of loyalty and love and dedication. And he poured it out on the ground as an offering to God. And I wish that's where it all ended. I just wish that's where the story stopped and we didn't get any additional information. But you go to that list of David's mighty men or his hardened warriors or his dedicated fighters, whatever your particular translation might say, and you read that list and you go down through that list, and there's a name in that list. You remember the name? Uriah the Hittite. And he poured out his love and his devotion. He brought to David the water of the devotion of his life to his king. David poured it out on the ground like sewer water. There's a lesson here that God wants David to learn in his life if he's going to be the king. And I think it took great courage for Jonathan to demonstrate to David the love and the commitment and the devotion that he did. So a small thing, the signal of a single error, and it told David how his whole life was about to change, how everything as he knew it was about to change. He would no longer be welcome at the palace. He would no longer be welcome among the army of Israel. He would no longer be able to go home. David now knew that he would have to live as a fugitive on the run from an angry, jealous king who was determined to destroy him. So it's time to say goodbye. Goodbye to Jonathan. Look at 41 and 42. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" You notice Jonathan just keeps bringing up that arrangement, that agreement. Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. And you read the story, and at this point, you just got a big knot right in the middle of your throat. David and Jonathan loved each other. They had such a strong bond of friendship. But you see, David couldn't stay, and Jonathan couldn't go. So they embraced and kissed and cried, and the text says David cried the most. If Jonathan had reason to weep, David had more. The pain of being separated was bad enough, but it was worse for David because he was now cut off from everything, including his wife, and was destined to live for many years as a fugitive. Jonathan knew he might never see David again. And as a matter of fact, if you read the rest of the story of David's life, David and Jonathan will only meet one more time. And it will be shortly before Jonathan dies. But now David is left for a life of hiding and secrecy and danger. Jonathan might have, and we might have expected him to have been greatly threatened by David, but instead he loved him and he was loyal to him. Jonathan, with his excellent character before God, served as an important role model in David's life. See, there will come a time when David will need to remember what true love really is, and what true loyalty really is, and what true character is all about. He's now seen it. God has given him an up-close personal example. He's seen it firsthand. But at this point, David will not return to what we might call normal life until Saul is dead and gone, and he is king. That's a pretty bleak road for David to walk, but it was God's chosen road for him. Was David in God's will? I believe he was. I think clearly he was. But how can anyone set on such a bleak path be in the will of God? Well, because God often has his people spend some time in uncomfortable places to mold them and shape them and fashion them for the task that God has that lies ahead. If you read the Bible, I think Job was there clearly. Joseph was there. Paul was there. Surely Jesus was there. And the bleak road is important in David's life. Because if God will put David in a place where so many people will depend on him, then God will need to teach David to depend on the Father, to depend on God and on him alone. Not himself, not Saul, not his army, not the strength of who he is and how many subjects he has, not Jonathan, not anyone else except God. And this road is important in David's life because David must learn to let God be his defender. He must learn to let God be his provider and his protector. It is important in David's life because he is going to receive a great position of authority. But you see, first he must learn to submit to the ultimate authority, to God's authority, even as he sits on the throne, even as he becomes the most important man in all of Israel. And I think David learned that through his ups and downs, through his great triumphs, and through his great sins. I think ultimately David learned that, and I think it's why God would say of him, he's a man after my own heart. Saul never learned it. He never did. And I believe therein is the great difference between the end result of those two kings. Well, I think we've covered the chapter, and I think we've covered the relationship that David had with both Jonathan and Saul. I think we're right back on track. So let me encourage you to read ahead. Dr. Lloyd will resume this discussion next Sunday, and we certainly look forward to what he has to say. Thank you so much for being in our class this morning.